You know, for over 800 years, there's been this one voice, a voice that's echoed through time and has literally outlasted entire empires. We're talking about the 13th century Persian poet, Saadi of Shiraz, often called the master of speech. So today, we're going to figure out how on earth did his words become immortal? Okay, listen to this. Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. Wow, that's the opening of Saadi's most famous poem, Bani Autumn. And that single idea, that if one of us is hurting, we all hurt, that is the absolute key to why he's still so relevant. I mean, doesn't that message feel just as urgent today as it must have 8 centuries ago? So you've probably heard this story, right? That these lines are carved right into the entrance of the UN headquarters. It's a great story, a powerful image, but it's not actually true. The reality, though, is maybe even more beautiful. In 2005, Iran gifted the UN this magnificent hand-woven Persian carpet, and woven right into it, this very palm. It's there, a testament to his vision of global unity. And that right there brings us to the big question we're tackling today. Just think about it. Saadi lived through the brutal Mongol invasions that just tore his world apart. So how did a guy from a time of such unbelievable chaos and violence create a body of work that's all about compassion and justice and our shared humanity? It's a fascinating puzzle. So let's dive in and find out. All right, here's our game plan. We'll start with his global impact. Then we'll look at the chaotic world that shaped him. After that, we'll dive into his two big masterpieces, see how he literally became an architect of the Persian language, and finally, we'll get into his enduring and, yeah, pretty complicated legacy. Okay, first up, his global impact. I mean, how did a poet from 13th century Shiraz even become a voice for the world? Especially way back then, long before, the internet or anything like it. So get this, who were his fans in the West? The list is basically a who's who of Western thought. We're talking about giants like Voltaire from the French Enlightenment, the German poet Goethe, and even the American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's incredible. What did they all see in his work? It was this universal wisdom that just spoke directly to what they were all searching for: reason, morality, and beauty. And here's a really crucial point. Saadi wasn't just influential, he was a trailblazer. His work was literally the first bridge connecting Persian literature to the European world. When his book, the Gulistan, that's the Rose Garden, was translated into French way back in 1634, it basically kicked open a door for Western thinkers to this whole new universe of ideas. So that brings us back to our big question. Where did all this wisdom come from? Well, to really get the depth of his ideas, you have to understand the world he lived in. And let me tell you, it was violent and incredibly uncertain. If you look at this timeline, you see two stories happening at once. On one hand, you've got Saadi's own journey. He's off studying in Baghdad, which was the intellectual heart of the Islamic world. But at the exact same time, you have the relentless march of the Mongol armies. And they would eventually sack that very city, ending a 500-year-old empire. But here's the most incredible part. It's right at the peak of all this chaos between 1257 and 1258 that he goes home and writes his two masterpieces. I mean, who does that? So how was that even possible? Well, his hometown, Shiraz, became this little oasis of peace in a world that was basically on fire. The ruler there made a really smart, pragmatic call. Instead of fighting the Mongols and getting wiped out, he just paid them tribute. And that single act of diplomacy saved the city. And it gave Saadi the peace and quiet, the sanctuary he needed to write. And that sanctuary allowed him to create his two gardens of wisdom. We're talking about the Gulistan, which means the rose garden, and the Bustan, the orchard. The easiest way to think about them is like this. The Bustan, the orchard, is his vision of how the world should be. It's like a poetic blueprint for a perfect, just society. But then you have the Gulistan, the rose garden, which he wrote a year later. That one's all about the world as it actually is, a witty, practical guide for navigating our messy, flawed reality. So you've got the ideal, and you've got the real. And together, they give you this incredible, complete picture of what it means to be human. So what's the secret sauce in his writing? There's this Persian concept for it, sal-e-mamtane. It translates to something like the simple but impossible to imitate. His writing is so clear, so direct, that it feels like, oh, I could write that. But then you try and you realize that perfect, effortless balance of rhythm and meaning and elegance is, well, it's pretty much impossible to copy. And that is the core of his genius. But Saadi's influence wasn't just about big ideas. It was about the words themselves. He was, in a very real way, an architect of the modern Persian language. Just look at his range here. I mean, he mastered a ton of different poetic forms. He absolutely perfected the ghazal, that's a type of lyric poem, and turned it into the best way to express deep emotions. At the same time, he'd use the Masnavi, these long rhyming couplets, for the big epic stories in his Bustan. The guy was a master of the entire poetic toolkit. And this mastery had a huge real-world impact. Get this number. Over 400. That's how many phrases from the Rose Garden alone have become common everyday proverbs in the Persian language, just from that one book. He didn't just write poetry, he literally wove his words into the fabric of the culture. And we're not talking about some obscure literary quotes here. These are living phrases that people still use today to give advice, to make a point. I mean, think about that. That's what it means to shape a language, when your lines, 800 years later, are still on people's lips. Ultimately, Saadi just set a new gold standard. His clear, elegant style became the model for generations of poets who came after him. Even the next great titan of Persian poetry, the legendary Hafiz, built his incredible palace of words on the very foundations that Saadi had already laid. Okay, so we've looked at his impact, his life, his art. But, like any giant historical figure, Saadi's legacy, it's complicated. And to really appreciate him, we have to be willing to look at the whole picture, the good and the challenging. So on one hand, you have Saadi the humanist, celebrated for his timeless wisdom and for perfecting a language. But when you look at his work through a modern lens, some of it is, well, it's challenging. For example, that famous pragmatism of his, like when he suggests a well-intentioned lie is better than a truth that causes chaos. Some modern critics see that as moral relativism. And of course, some of his views on society and love definitely reflect the 13th century, not the 21st, and they get critiqued today. Really understanding his legacy means we have to grapple with all of it. And that leaves us with one last big thought. Saadi personally watched one of the world's great empires, the Abbasid Caliphate, literally crumble into dust. And yet his words, which he wrote in a small, quiet city shielded from the storm, they've survived for almost 1,000 years. So what is it? What is it about art, about poetry, about a simple, honest sentence that makes it more durable than stone and stronger than any army? I think that, right there, is the enduring power of Saadi.